Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Start with here, we have a question. It says, how can I convince my wife that she's really important to me? Well, first, convince yourself. If you really believe that she is, and you think about the many different ways that she is important to you, I think then you can find a way to show her. By the way, what came along that prompted a question like that? Have you been taking her for granted? The old marriage vows, for better, for worse, and for granted. But all of us need to feel important, and certainly important to our spouse. Okay, here's another question. The spark has gone out of our marriage, sort of like the last question. Have you any suggestions? Well, of course, anytime a spark is going out, people could say light a fire. But the common problem I find so often when the spark has gone out are words to that effect that people quit doing what they enjoyed doing. It's fairly easy to go back in memory with people and find out when they first met what they liked to do, why they liked to be with each other, what they were doing, what was enjoyable. And usually people enjoy reviewing that sort of history. Then we find that they quit doing it. They aren't having fun. They aren't doing the things that they like to do. And this is so often the case. So my suggestion would be to do a review of that sort of thing. Find out, go back in memory. Find out what you were doing when you first fell in love. See if that spark doesn't come back. I think you'll find that most of the time it will. Here's one I have to share with a tongue-in-cheek. It asks me, do I prescribe Viagra? I don't have a license to prescribe any medicines. And what I do prescribe for problems associated with something of Viagra would be to look at the relationship. Improving the relationship usually improves any kind of sexual dysfunction. Makes it more tolerable or acceptable even when there are physical conditions. Should say particularly if there are physical conditions. But most of the time, particularly for younger people, younger than middle age, the problem is not physical. Most of the time it's in a relationship. Here's one. Very similar to something we talked about the last time. Question was, has there been a dramatic increase in homosexuality in the past decade? I don't think so. I think what we find is that more people are willing to be open, willing to be upfront about it, out of the closet, so to speak. We have so much programming. The news puts it in the forefront, much more so than used to be. There's no reason to believe that the basic problem has increased. However, there's been a lot of encouragement, and it's unfortunate because the gay and lesbian rights groups have been extremely effective in getting their education programs and suggestions into schools all the way down to kindergarten. And it's sad sometimes because, well, as I mentioned last time, any youngster, and about a fourth of them have a question about their gender and their orientation. That's just common. It seems that so many times they're being encouraged to go ahead and try the homosexual lifestyle. When in truth, it seems that most of the time only about 2% of the people really get into that. And so encouraging people to try it is, I don't think it's a good decision. It's not a good prescription. I think public schools really ought to stay out of it. Here's another question. It says, is psychoanalysis still used today? I get inquiries about this from time to time because perhaps I do a little. I sort of cut my teeth in psychoanalysis way back in the 40s, the early 50s. I was having training, going to training sessions. But no, in answer to the question, it's rarely used today, except for people who have a lot of money and time. It's rarely used to treat specific illnesses. And the way it's used is quite different the way it started with Freud and his followers at the time. It's used with a more specific purpose. I think it's still a good therapy, but there are other things that are much quicker and are just as efficient. Excuse me. Here's one that came in, and I recall the question, and has so many types of memories that go along with it. The question basically was, my little girl, the youngest of three, keeps asking me which of the children do I love the most. It's a pretty common question in families with children. And the party said, other than the obvious need for attention, how can a parent give a good answer? Well, my suggestion is to think of something special about each child, and to answer the little girl, the youngest of three, answer her that, sure, you love them all the same, but you especially like and pick out and love the particular characteristic about each one. The reason I say that is because children are much easier in their own thinking, the way they think. They'll find it much easier to be accepting of your answer if you have a particular reason, something concrete to point to. Such as maybe the oldest child is always very generous. Maybe the middle child is always very helpful. Whatever the youngest child's particular characteristic is. Say you love them all the same, but especially do you like, and go ahead and give your particular answer based on what the child is really like. And here's another one that comes up only very recently. I find it somewhat troublesome in the literature. It says, is there a pattern in society where we go in circles? And this came up recently because of studies about diversity and all kinds of things going on about diversity on college campuses. The answer, yes, there seems to be a circle there. About 30 years ago, everybody was talking about integration, getting everybody integrated and have no lines of color or cultural differences, and everybody do basically the same thing. What we're hearing today is diversity. The University of Vermont, we see programs on the news from time to time, excuse me, where they're focusing on increasing the diversity. Plattsburgh State, other college campuses. Well, what's diversity? It seems to me it's going around in the circle, trying to emphasize, well, let's get people who are different. Well, 30 years ago we were saying let's treat everybody the same and act like there are no differences. So it goes along with political correctness that in some respects that seems to be getting so far out of hand that it's not even safe to comment on it. If you're on a college campus or you're involved in any kind of program that has federal funding, being politically correct is just the end thing. And I guess it's very important to some people, but maybe some people, that's what they get paid for doing, is being the police on freedom of speech. Now, we don't have freedom of speech anymore. We have to speak in a certain way, do a certain thing. You know, you probably all of you seen the news where some of these big athletic groups, professional teams, have been asked to change names so that they don't reflect the culture. Well, I think that's absurd, but that's my opinion. Here's a question. At what age do I think children need to start school? Over the years, some of my students and working with universities studied this question over and over again. It seems to me the best age kept coming out about age 6 is a good time to start school. Seems early enough, and these earlier school programs seem to be related much more to the mother's needs than the child's needs. More and more women going to work, nobody home, no adults at home. So the schools have been taking on more and more jobs of babysitting, child care centers, preschool and pre-preschool, after-school programs, feeding breakfast, feeding lunches. Studies, I recall the first major study in the late 60s that was studying Head Start, whether or not it was of any value. And for the children, it didn't really seem to be a significant difference. But so much politics got into it. Head Start has been operated more of a program for parents and a center for welfare mothers. So its original intention, I think the best evidence and several other follow-up studies, I think, as my memory goes, showed pretty much the same thing, that the advantages that seemed to be there for Head Start, preschool, were pretty well gone by the grade 4 and 5. So the answer is, well, maybe they weren't so good. Here's another one, sort of a strange kind of thing. It says there are a few reports of what was once called child abuse, sex between adults and children. These reports, some of them are coming out saying that isn't necessarily bad. And I was asked the question about what do I think about that, and am I familiar with them? Yes, I'm very familiar with them. And it's troublesome. Troublesome particularly for this reason. It was considered a universal taboo. Incest was and is a universal taboo, meaning that in virtually any society that had been studied, that was forbidden. Now, that was throughout history. All of the societies that have been studied, and there have been over 4,000 of them studied, that was a consistent and is a consistent finding. So by what logic, what rhyme or reason do we see that now some people come along and say, oh, but that's not bad. What's bad about it is all the hoopla and hullabaloo and all the hush-hush that surrounds it. You know, about 25 years ago, I've forgotten her name right now, but there was a senator, a New York senator. I think she was also a former district attorney in New York City. But about 25 years ago, the senator in Albany was sponsoring a bill to make incest not illegal. That bothered me. I went to Albany, which was common in those days, and I kept asking people, legislators, what was the advantage? What would the advantage be of making incest not illegal? I never did get a good answer. But we have groups today, even professional groups. American Psychological Association, one of the main committees has come out in support of that. That sex between, and the studies have been on men and boys, that isn't necessarily harmful. What we see, and it's always been this way, we see some kids who are resilient. It doesn't seem to matter what these kids are exposed to. They seem to turn out all right. We see that from time to time. And you can imagine what we're seeing on the news and what children are exposed to in these various countries with ethnic cleansing, all kinds of things going on. But maybe that's not the majority of them. And I think the majority of these children who are exposed to these, I'm going to call them atrocities, American Association of Boy Man Lovers. That's a group that is sponsoring this sort of thing and pushing it. It's part of the gay and lesbian rights groups. I think it's a very sad commentary on our society. Somebody doesn't have enough to do, sit around and think about passing laws that removes, I don't know how old it is, but centuries and centuries and centuries of universal thought. To make something like that, try to make it much more open and acceptable. You know, I have a problem because I have a bias. I think attorneys, having gone through law school, having had the wits about them to pass a bar examination, I think they have to be above average intelligence to do that. And it bothers me that some of these people, above average intelligence, but they seem to be so dumb. I think that's what it is. They don't seem to be able or willing to put perhaps first things first. And it's a strange sort of thing to think that we could have a society where groups are promoting this and another group stand by saying, oh yeah, it's all right, let's let everybody do this sort of thing, regardless of age. I find it very puzzling. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. I have an interesting one to start with today, and I've listened to it around quite a bit. But the question was put to me, what do I think about the fad about the tattoos in both men and women? Recent blossoming of tattoos. Well, at first I find it a little difficult to reconcile with good taste and beauty. The other day I was in a local drugstore, and the clerks were talking about getting tattoos. Two young women, and one of them had a visible tattoo. Taboo, there's a Freudian slip. But I was sort of brought into the conversation, and I volunteered that for people my age, when women had tattoos, they were most often associated with a lady of the street, a woman of the red light district, a woman of ill repute, or some kind of sideshow carnival. And I don't think these two young clerks even knew what I was talking about. To say red light district, I don't think they had a clue. Women of ill repute, they should have known. Once in my early professional years, I had the opportunity, or part of my job assignment in the hospital, was working with girls who were sent there who had become mentally ill from the state training school for girls. And it was a serious thing. Some of these girls, all of them were declared juvenile delinquents, wards of the state. And what they were doing was tattooing themselves. Self-inflicted damage. They were tattooing themselves, forever branding themselves as bad girls. I had counseling with them, and group counseling, group sessions with some of these girls. And we'd talk about these things. Certainly, some of these girls had a lot of help in becoming bad girls in the name of society. But what they were doing was labeling themselves, branding themselves to be part of a gang, be part of a herd, if you will. Like some men brand their cattle. Okay, here was a group of girls who were branded. I find that a little difficult, and I've found it difficult to try to think. I've yet to see, and I'm fairly familiar with different cultures and tattoos, but I fail to see how it improves one's beauty. If you have a tattoo, how does that help? Well, I was in the Navy once upon a time, and you see the Navy guys get tattoos, some of them very fancy. And I always thought, well, that's more expression of probably being drunk when they're out on liberty or something. They seem to want to get drunk to have a tattoo. I guess the best way to answer that is maybe I don't really understand it. I see it. Let's go to another question. It says, I keep hoping that there will be a season with decent television shows. Do I know what happened? Well, first let's start with there are plenty of decent television shows if you just take the time to look for them. Particularly if you have cable or satellite, there are some excellent educational programs. Really worthwhile. And on a variety of topics. So people who keep saying there are no good television shows, I guess what they're doing is looking at the popular channels. Or they're quoting somebody else. They either want to watch the shows they're calling bad, or they're not taking the trouble to find the good ones. There are plenty of good ones. But speaking of decency, the question had to do with, are there any decent shows? Decency is a special topic. There's a Professor DeMarco at St. Jerome University in Waterloo, Ontario. He has a book out on a regular column, and the book out on decency. And society has changed dramatically in what's called decent, on its standards of what's vulgar, what's obscene, what's profane, blasphemous language. All of these have become so common. Obscene. You know what the word comes from? It comes from off stage. Basically, that's what it means. It means it's not center stage. Obscene is off the scene. And what we have seen is that the off-center material has become center stage, not the mainstream. I think we ought to have a language code. And quoting Professor DeMarco, I think he has a very interesting statement. He says, there is never a season for foul language to be generally acceptable. The words of the 17th century poet, he quotes W.D. Rosamond, still apply. Immodest words admit no defense. For want of decency is want of sense. I think that still applies. And those of us who prefer a different language, well, perhaps we need to practice what we're advocating. We need to light a candle, so to speak, and show people how to talk. I do listen to people from time to time, and I get to wondering, is that the entire vocabulary? Do these people have want of sense? Do they know anything else? And some of them do. It's kind of sad. Well, here's another one. Interesting, says, I'm a grandfather, and sometimes I babysit my grandsons. The parents, my daughter and son-in-law, use timeouts for discipline. We didn't have that when I was a child. Does it work? Well, number one, you did have it when you were a child. You just don't remember it. I bet you can remember standing in a corner, putting on a dunce cap, sitting on a dunce stool. Well, those are timeouts. Same thing. And yes, timeouts seem to work if they're done correctly, but doing it correctly requires the caretaker to be disciplined. If you tell a child time out and keep talking to the child, that's not time out. If you put a child in a place where the child is supposedly isolated and you keep going back to the person, see how the person's doing, well, that's not time out. It's a very old form of punishment. very old and one of the most effective forms of punishment. Shunning basically is what it is. A timeout is to, okay, you're over there and you're not part of this group. You're not to talk, you're not to interact, and the group will not interact with you. So that's how it's done. And when it's done that way, I think it can be a very effective discipline. I've watched it. I remember seeing the pattern of timeout when it was first called timeout and quit being called go stand in the corner. That was what was popular when I was in school. Sometimes it's overused. I worked with a boy one time who spent most of his school years out in the hall in timeout. Oh, he enjoyed it. He would do something deliberately to have timeout. He got more of his thinking done. He had more of his whatever he was doing. He enjoyed it. I think he had a high school certificate in timeout more than anything else. Kind of like throwing the rabbit in the briar patch for him. Too many parents say, go to your room. Well, what do they have in the room? They may have a television set, they may have video, computer games, they have all sorts of things, and really the child is not being punished. If you put them in a place where they have all kinds of interactive machinery or gadgets, patterns, some people even say that, and at the same time don't restrict the use of a telephone. Maybe some children have a telephone in their room. So they go to the room and call somebody. I think any kind of discipline has the old formula that I've mentioned so often on this program: firm, consistent kindness. If that's the way it's done, it'll work. Timeout reminds me of dog obedience training. I recall when first time I was really introduced to it, I took a dog that I thought was terrible to a dog obedience school, and the first thing I learned was I had to be the one to learn discipline. The trainer, the master, had to be the one who learned discipline. I think that's a problem with so many children today. If you're willing to discipline yourself, timeout can work beautifully. Okay, here's another one. It says, I have 2 children and I'm run ragged. How, if you can, tell me in the world, how do mothers of large families cope? With precision, that's how they cope. They organize their families and they delegate. They delegate and probably don't run. Most mothers of large families don't seem to be particularly harassed and run down and overstressed like you see the modern mother. I remember a woman in Altona. It's not too far from here, about 12 miles. About 25, 30 years ago, I was doing some recruitment for some kind of programming. And this woman was 17 children. Came up, she was interested in what I was talking about and said, what can I do? I'm not trained to do anything. Somebody told me she had 17 children. My answer then would be the same answer now. A mother of 17 children, there's not much she can't do. She's done everything. And this particular woman, I didn't believe she had 17 children. She looked like she'd stepped right out of some beauty salon. Front pages of Vogue magazine. But the answer to the question was large families that people have to organize, they have to prioritize. What's really important? They have to plan what they're going to do, and they delegate. Older children take care of younger children. They expect performance and compliance. You don't have time to tell somebody to do something 5 times if you have 5 children. No, if you have 1 child, you can have the time to tell them to do something 5 times. And that's a matter of training for the children. I don't know why people insist on having children have to be told 5 times to stop doing something or to do something. I see it so often. It's just part of the pattern. They plug in and this message is going to be repeated 5 times. The children learn that very quickly. But no 2 children have the same family. You know, the child who's youngest doesn't have the same family as the child who's the older child. Middle child doesn't have the same family as the younger or the older ones. Each one is treated differently, and each one sees the family differently. So we organize around the best means. We organize by planning it. What is it we really want to do? How do we want to do it? And some people who have a lot of children perhaps do much more work in the long run, but without putting any stress and effort into it, compared to some of these harassed mothers I see. It seems to be the mothers who are doing most of the running. Of course, what do I know? I only have 7 children. So, do I know anything about large families? Some people think that's a large family. I never did. There's another prescription I like to share with people, and I've done this before on this program, is to spend 5 minutes of undivided time. 5 minutes. Individual, undivided time with each child. I remember I mentioned that to the woman with 17 children in Altona, and she said, how can I possibly do that? I don't have time. And I said, well, we're not talking about even an hour and a half. Do you have an hour and a half that you could actually spend with 17 children? She said, of course. Just like that. 5 minutes. Here's what you're going to find. 5 minutes of undivided attention. First few times, the children won't want 5 minutes of undivided attention. But they'd like to know that it's there when they do want it. Sort of in the bank. I did a study in Plattsburgh and found that over 50% of the children had 0 time alone with either parent the previous day, during the previous 24 hours. It was a random sample of the city of Plattsburgh, a random sample for the day of the week to try and take in consideration all kinds of variables. And so often people really didn't know what that was. What do you mean undivided attention? Try it. When's the last time you had 5 minutes of undivided attention from someone? Really undivided, not shared time, not with a radio, not with a television program going, not while driving, although that's probably the second best time, just parenting a child in a car. But you're not giving full attention undivided if you're doing something else. Not while washing dishes or sweeping the floor or something else. 5 minutes of undivided attention. I think you'll find it'll work. And you may find it'll work for you with your favorite spouse, too. Well, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, Family Life in the North Country. Start with, have a question about oldest children. It says, I heard the oldest child trying to run the families. Is that a pattern? There is such thing called eldest child syndrome, in which the oldest child in a family, usually a girl, will take on responsibility, sometimes when not even asked or expected to, will assume responsibility for running the family. And now there are sometimes very good results from this, particularly if the family is broken. If a mother is no longer in the home, a divided or separated family, like divorce or death of a parent, that may work very well. And there are a lot of old-timers, people my age, who have told me that, well, their oldest sister took care of them. It's a pattern sometimes that is not particularly healthy, and you have to look at it and see what it's really about. Sometimes it is very stressful for the children. I've seen oldest children, the eldest child syndrome, trying to run families because the family was chaotic. Everybody was there. Nobody died. It was an intact family. But it wasn't organized. And children try to make sense out of it. So yes, there is such a thing. It can be a very positive thing, and it can also have negative consequences. So if you see this, Why not just look at it, talk about it with the oldest child? Sometimes it is not even intentional. It's not something planned by either the child or the parents. I'm certainly aware that sometimes the parents impose it, like I just mentioned recently about large families. Delegating authority, delegating to the older children to take care of younger children. Well, that's part of the same kind of thing. But sometimes this happens and nobody's really planned it. But look at it, see what it is. See if it's working, whether it's stressful for the eldest child or what happens with the younger children. Here's another one, change of subject. It says, my son, one of my sons rather, wants to get some body jewelry. I'm ashamed. How can I dissuade him not to do that? First, I don't know. Second, don't buy it. Don't pay for it. Third, ask what the message is he intends to give with this body jewelry for the rest of his life. Some of this body jewelry, pokes holes and has to be by poking holes. It's scarred. Sometimes infections occur. Some of it really isn't safe, in particular where people put it. And the last suggestion is just say no, you're not going to, and hope for the best. I'm really at a loss to understand body jewelry today. I know it's a fad, but I think it's a strange thing for people to have a barbell in their tongue, piercing the tongues. That doesn't make sense to me. I'd be very interested in what anybody would like to let me know. Drop me a note. Zip code 12921-0519. Drop me a note. 12921-0519. Would like your opinion about that. I had a physician friend who's a retired military colonel. He does a lot of employment physicals, industrial medicine. He told me he is yet to understand it. He finds body jewelry in the strangest places. He says he's asked practically everybody where he finds body jewelry, why, and he hasn't had a good answer yet. I can understand if there's competition, for example, somebody saying, well, I'm wearing the biggest jewelry or the heaviest or the gaudiest or the most expensive or the smallest or the most obscene or whatever. If there's a contest going on, something like that, that would seem to make sense with young people, but this certainly is not limited to young people, is it? You get nose rings and ear things and eyebrow things and tongue things and belly things and on and on. According to this physician, on and on. Seems to be no restriction where you find this body jewelry. But does it enhance the beauty? I'm well aware that there are cultures where certain body jewelry and some deformities, if you will, are considered very appropriate. But I don't understand it in this culture. I'd be happy to hear from you. Anybody who would like to drop me a line. Here's another one. Has to do with breaking families. Has to do with divorces. What do I think about joint custody, equal custody for the children when the parents split? I don't like it. I think children need a primary home. They need to have their time organized so that the children and the parents know that certain times, certain days, certain activities take place. And if the children are in equal homes and they're shuttling between these homes, say Monday is at this home and Tuesday is this home and Wednesday is back over here and Thursday back at the other one and so on. And some families try to do that. It's an expense without profit, seems to me. In other words, to maintain two equal homes is more expensive but I don't think it's good for the children. I'm well aware that sometimes the primary custodian, the parent with the primary custody, is the one who is blamed for a lot of things. And the visiting parent, if it's not set up right, is sort of the show parent, where that parent comes in and tries to buy things or do things or do a lot of special, when the usual routines and the drudgery, so to speak, is on the custodial parent. But I think people should work these things out. They can work them out best by working together and have primary custody, have reasonable visitations, and times when they don't visit. Here's another one. It says, when folks get old, how can we take care of them and keep our jobs too? Well, obviously a question of somebody who's troubled by the jobs, having to do a lot of different things. Well, I don't think nursing homes are the answer. I think people should be independent as long as they are independent. I certainly respect a person's right and desire to be independent. We see that a lot. I've never seen it when it wasn't there with somebody who had an intact mind. We all want to be independent. And to be put in a place where we have no decision making, we have no options that we can control, is very demeaning, demoralizing. And certainly a lot of people are put in custodial facilities these days who don't need to be there. Different cultures here. We have some cultures in the world where that's just unheard of and unthinkable, because the old folks are supposed to stay at home in those cultures. We have cultures like some parts of the U.S. where it's considered that old folks are not supposed to stay at home. You know, being old doesn't necessarily mean disease. It doesn't mean handicapped or incompetent. Being old is being old. Being old means you've lived a long time. It doesn't have to mean all kinds of negatives. Just the other day, a brilliant lecture. And somebody who after the lecture responded to questions from people less than half his age. He was 83, I believe. Beautiful. Mind sharp as a tack. To think about putting that old man in a nursing home, well, this wouldn't make sense. A frail body doesn't necessarily mean a frail mind. We found that out years ago. Help people up, but don't support them as long as they can do something and learn from themselves. And old people can also learn new things. They can learn new ways of coping, particularly if they're motivated. So I think people need to look at it. What is it? There are new places coming into being where people who do need help, daycare for the elderly. Nobody's going to be home, and some people do need help, assistance. Then fine, that's appropriate. Use it. Best way to go. Okay, here's another question. Says, one of my relatives is being released from a mental hospital. How should we treat him? Excuse me. The word normal is the first thing that comes to mind. Treat him normally, to the extent you can. If you aren't given any instructions by the hospital, and most of the time, if there's something special that needs to be done, the hospital social workers will meet with you and tell you what needs to be done and how special things might have to be done. But if nothing like that happened, then assume that the person is considered able to adjust to the routine. First, let the person know what your routine in your home is. Be open about it. Tell the person what restrictions, if any, you're going to have, or what particular activities are expected in your home. Don't ask questions about the cause of the illness and what caused the person to be sick. Chances are the person doesn't know. Let him tell you if he wants to. I've been on the other side of the fence so many times working in hospitals, helping the patient who's going to be released learn how to adjust to families. it's always a problem, always a question there too. And sometimes they were very anxious, reticent to go visit somebody because they were afraid of how the treatment was going to be done. What kind of treatment or were they going to receive? What was going to be expected of them? Now, if the relative is delusional or hallucinating, it used to be that people with delusions, hallucinations weren't permitted to leave hospital, but nowadays that's not a big factor. But if a person has either of these conditions, don't argue about it. If somebody hears voices, don't try to convince them they don't. If somebody is delusional, which means a false, unshakable belief, don't waste your time trying to change a person's opinion about it. That's why it's called delusion. It's a false, unshakable belief. You waste your time and you'll just irritate the person. The person doesn't have that sort of thing because it's desirable on his part. It occurs, and for the time being, we don't have a good explanation of why it occurs. So, expect the person to fit in. If you have chores that need to be done, ask for help, and let them fit right in to the extent that you can. And I think you'll find it'll work rather well. Here's one a little bit different slant. From a mother who's divorced. Says she has 3 children, 8, 11, and 14. The oldest, 14, is a boy. And her problem is that the boy's father has every other weekend visitation, and on his every other weekend he wants to take the boy both Saturday and Sunday fishing, winter and summer. He's a big ice fisherman, and whatever is in the thing, it's fishing or hunting sometimes, but for the whole weekend. And there ain't anything wrong with that, except this mother said when they married, they made promises about their religion, and the father certainly was part of it, agreed heartily about how the children would be reared in religion. And now he doesn't seem to want to do that. And so his wanting to be off fishing and hunting every weekend, every other weekend when he visits, with the 14-year-old, interferes with the 14-year-old going to church. What can be done? Well, the 14-year-old's in a double bind. Wrong either way it goes. The father, I guess, because he's already disavowed his marriage vows, is also saying, well, religion's not important anymore. So it might be the best thing for the 14-year-old, if he really wants to go to church himself, for him to tell the father, Dad, I want to go to church. When we go fishing, drop me off in whatever church, whatever's involved here, and pick me up later if you don't want to go. Or let's hey, Dad, let's just plan to include church in our weekends. Chances are, if the 14-year-old is really interested, he'll have more impact than you will. Because this woman told me that her attorney said, forget it. You're not going to get a court to try to force somebody to go to church. Courts don't seem to work that way. Even though that may have been a promise and a contractual obligation when the marriage took place, the lawyer in this particular case was telling this woman, forget it. You're not going to get a court trying to enforce some kind of religion. But my suggestion would be for the 14-year-old to have a good conversation. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one.